Good evening. Welcome to the Cape Charles Town Council Town Hall meeting, January 27th, 2022. Can I get a roll call?
Holloway present.
Bennett present.
Buckholz present.
O'Brien present.
Grossman present.
Fulmer present, calling in from Minocqua, Wisconsin.
Chili.
Thank you, sir. All right, let it be known we've established a quorum. I'd like to welcome everybody here this evening. We appreciate your time coming out, and this is an important part of our town. So the purpose of tonight's town hall meeting is to understand the purpose and goals of the Historic District Design Guidelines and Update Project, to receive the results of public opinion survey from last November, December that has been used to inform this update process, to get an overview of the new design guidelines content, and to have a brief question and answer session about that project. With all of that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hosey, our time manager. Mr. Hosey?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Again, welcome everybody. And also just to make sure everyone understands that this is a town hall meeting, and what that means is that it's kind of it's more of an informal structure. So we're going to be giving some information and presentations, but then afterwards, when it gets to the question and answers, it's going to be more conversational, more informal. So if you have questions, we'll be able to answer them, and it's not like a formal meeting. So with that, I'm going to start with some background that set the stage here for tonight that kind of led to this project. The Town Council adopted the Historic District Overlay Zoning Ordinance, which established the local Historic District Overlay Zone and the Historic District Review Board back in December of 2001. The local Historic District Overlay is a local zoning district that sits on top of the underlying zoning districts like C1 and C2, okay? That's why it's called an overlay zone. This is more restrictive with some of the standards because it's meant to preserve the historic character of the town's resources, but it does not regulate land uses beyond just aesthetic controls for the district. Now this should not be confused with the Cape Charles Historic District listed in the Virginia Landmarks Register or the National Register of Historic Places. Those don't regulate anything. However, our local overlay does regulate the exterior appearances of our historic properties, their demolition, and any new construction within that area. Our Historic District Overlay has a guidebook called the Cape Charles Historic District Design Guidelines. The first set of these guidelines was adopted back in 2001 and was last updated in 2018. We recently hired Commonwealth Preservation Group, or CPG, out of Norfolk to work with us on another update to these design guidelines. The reason for this update is because a lot's changed since 2018. With Cape Charles largely transitioning to more of a vacation rental home community. This has resulted in increased investment by people purchasing historic homes and converting them into vacation rentals. Some of these new investors knew that they were purchasing property in a locally regulated historic district, though many did not, nor did their realtors fully explain that to them. As a result, improvements are sometimes made in properties without people getting the proper permits or the required certificate of appropriateness required by the town. We've seen people even demolish properties without proper approval or start to build new homes without the necessary permits or approvals. In some cases, the current design guidelines don't provide sufficient information regarding some of these things or don't even address it at all. CPG is very experienced in working with towns like ours across Virginia, helping with their guidelines and zoning ordinances. Most recently, CPG has helped the town of Herndon and the city of Virginia Beach, and currently working with the city of Suffolk on theirs. So we're very pleased to have them with us, working with us on this project. We hope to wrap it up later this spring with a new set of design guidelines and recommendations for the underlying historic district zoning ordinance, both of which So as we'll go through other public processes for comment. Paige Pollard is the owner of CPG, and her team are here tonight, and they're going to go through a presentation with you where they're going to start off with reviewing the agenda. They're going to present an overview of the public survey results from last fall that they've been using to help with this update, and present an overview of the first draft of these revised guidelines. So please be gentle with them as they go through their presentation and the question and answer period following. They are here to receive your feedback. Once we get the revised draft guidelines, so this is, we're working through draft one, we're going to get some input, and then we'll have a second set of a second draft that will come out. When that happens, we will post that on our website so that the public can review them, and we can get comment from everybody before anything goes final. You'll be able to send those comments directly to me. I'm the main point of contact with that. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Paige Pollard from Commonwealth Preservation Group, who will take it from here.
Good evening. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Can you hear me all right with my mask on? We go to a lot of different construction sites and in a lot of different communities, so to keep you safe, we just have this as a policy. If you have trouble hearing me, please do let me know. I think I'm 6 foot distant from everyone, so I can demask if necessary. Thank you all for inviting us, and thank you for the introduction. We've had a great time working with the community so far, and we're excited to be at this point in the guidelines and really moving forward with content development. The team that's working on this project within our office is mostly represented here tonight. Gerald Phillips, who's got over 25 years of experience in municipal planning and regional planning, and is AICP certified. Katie Paulson, who has a background in historic preservation and a master's in preservation at Architecture School at University of Texas. She has been working on design guidelines at our firm for about 7 years. And myself, I've been in the field for about 23 years. Opened CPG about 18 years ago, and we work with localities across the state on this kind of thing. And I will be the first to admit, design guidelines are tricky. We're trying to bridge across a wide variety of views, which we will show you tonight. And at the end of this process, we want to have a document that everyone can get behind. Not everyone's going to be happy with every element, but we want everyone to be comfortable with the process, with their understanding, and that we kind of get the community in the middle. Okay? The one person who couldn't join us tonight is Jess Archer, who actually put together this presentation. She does all of our graphic content. She created a graphic identity for the guidelines, and that you'll see consistently through this. We wanted to start with an overview because there have been so many newcomers to the historic district, new property owners, new business owners, new staff, and we wanted to make sure everyone was kind of grounded in how we got to where we are. So, we're going to talk about the history of the district, the enabling authorities of some of the regulations. We're going to talk a little bit about this project, obviously. Then we're going to give you a summary of the stakeholder engagement. We have a lot more information on each of these topics than we're presenting tonight. If there's something that's of particular interest, please reach out to John and we can provide additional detail. We're going to give you a preview of the guidelines so you can see the direction we're headed in, and then we're going to have that sort of open, cordial question and answer session.
Excuse me, Paige.
Yes.
Could you speak into the microphone? We're getting a lot of comments that they cannot hear you.
Sure, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
You can walk around
You
with
can
it
take
too.
the mic with you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Actually, you need to plug it in.
Okay, now when I trip over my own cord, don't laugh, okay? So we were hired by the town with a very specific and clear scope of work. That scope of work was that we were to look at all of the regulations, the zoning, engage with the community, look at the boundaries of the historic district, and write a revised set of guidelines that better met the community's vision and goals, the philosophy for preservation that the town council reviewed and agreed upon, and also meets professional best practices, because Cape Charles is a certified local government, and you want to maintain that level of professionalism in your program. So, this is a brief overview of how Cape Charles has approached historic preservation up to this point. In the late 1980s, the Historic District was originally listed on the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places. That nomination was updated in 2018. That recognizes the community for its significant historic architecture, for the history and development of the community, but it provides no protection for those attributes. State and National Register designation is recognition only. It is also a gateway to be able to access historic tax credits. Some property owners in this community have done that, but it does not, in its own right, protect the historic community. The Historic District Overlay Zoning Ordinance is enabled by legislation that we'll talk about in a minute. It was adopted by the town council in the early 2000s. 2001, I think I heard. We've been having trouble pinning that date down. Early 2000s. In that adoption, the local review board was established and given certain responsibilities, which we'll talk about. Also in that process, the first set of design guidelines were written. And those remained in place all the way until an update in 2018. So by the time you started to look at your first update in 2018, they were pretty stale, honestly, and probably causing a lot of angst and conflict and confusion. In 2007, Cape Charles was accepted as a certified local government. That meant that the town initiated an agreement with the Commonwealth of Virginia and the National Park Service to get recognition that there was a sound preservation program at work here, and that they wanted to solidify a relationship so they could get some technical assistance, so they could pursue grant funding, and just ensure that they were maintaining a program that met professional best practices. That was 2007. The Historic Preservation Plan was developed that sort of guides policy around preservation in general, both including the local historic district and then just in a larger context. And then in 2019, in our analysis of documents, we noticed that there were questions about historic preservation and the importance of historic properties in the 2019 update to the comp plan citizen survey. Through that, we were able to get a beginning of a snapshot of how the community viewed preservation. I mentioned on the previous slide, the Cape Charles Historic Overlay District was adopted in about 2001. It's important to understand in Virginia, we're a Dillon's rule state. That means that a local government cannot engage in regulatory activity unless that activity in general has been authorized by the General Assembly in Richmond. So, the Commonwealth of Virginia says, in the Code of Virginia, that the only way to protect historic properties in the Commonwealth is through a local historic district. So, if the community seeks to protect its historic resources and character, the local overlay district is the conduit through which that can be done. And that is the mechanism that was used to establish the district in 2001-ish. The guidelines that we're preparing are intended to regulate that overlay district. They're intended to be an update to the 2018 guidelines. Now, when we prepare design guidelines, Professional best practices are to follow federal guidance, which is put out by the National Park Service for the treatment of historic properties. There are 4 different levels of standards that you can elect to use. We use what's called the rehabilitation standards. Those are the most lenient of the standards that are professionally recognized for preservation. The other standards are restoration, which is like what you would think of as a museum quality, taking a building back in time kind of an endeavor. Preservation guidelines actually would cause you to freeze the building in time and not let it deteriorate, but also not make any improvements. If anyone's ever been to Drayton Hall outside of Charleston, that's the best example of a group using preservation standards. We use the rehabilitation standards, which are the most lenient. They recognize changes need to happen over time, but that those changes need to be made with a light touch, and they need to be made in a reversible way so that you don't undermine what is left of the historic character of a house or a building. So we are using the rehabilitation standards. I mentioned the Certified Local Government Program, and I talked about that a couple slides ago. Basically, that partnership provides access to technical assistance, to funding. It gives confidence by the property owners being regulated that the activities of the community are in keeping with kind of best standards. You guys have benefited from that relationship in a few ways. It was used to fund recent survey activity. I understand there was a time when the Certified Local Government Coordinator was asked actually to come to Cape Charles and sort of look at some of the decisions that were being made and give a third-party opinion. So you benefited from that relationship. Now, let's talk about the role of the review board for a minute. Their job is basically to review alterations, additions, demolition, and new construction, to treat people with respect in review of those applications, and to maintain consistency based on the adopted guidelines. That last one is really important because when we go through this guidelines revision, there are going to be changes. And if the community supports the guidelines and the council adopts the guidelines, it's going to cause a change in the process and a change in the expectations. The board has to be committed to following through on that. And the community has to understand that the board's decisions are going to be related to those new guidelines. So coming in and saying, well, my neighbor did this in 2007 and it wasn't allowed, or it was allowed, or you didn't like it or you did like it, is kind of going to be irrelevant because there'll be new guidelines. Okay, so that's just a really important thing for folks to keep in mind. We put this graphic over on the left to show you everyone's talking about how many appeals there are, and it seemed amplified to us when we heard it. So we wanted to understand the statistics. So these statistics are from the town clerk that say that between 2020 and 2021, there were 104 applications, 92 approvals. Several were, I guess, tabled or conditioned, and I guess they're still pending, and 1 appeal. And the year prior, there was 1 appeal. Now, 2018 to 2019 looked like a year of conflict, perhaps, but this is not a bad set of statistics over the last couple of years. So that makes us think that maybe there are some issues with the process, with the education, and maybe with some gaps or some lack of clarity in the guidelines that really need to be attended to in the revision. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we're engaging with the folks in Cape Charles. We had some detailed internal stakeholder interviews very early. Our goal with those is to really try and understand what's going on in the community from a bunch of different perspectives, because we feel like when we hear a bunch of different perspectives, the truth is usually somewhere kind of in the middle, and it gives us the most clear understanding of what we need to address and focus on. Through the stakeholder interviews, there were several things that were very similar that we heard from most everyone. Not 100%, but almost everyone. That the architectural look and feel of the historic district is something that's valued. There's a desire to maintain that. That the process of applying from kind of the time that you walk into town hall until the time that you get your certificate of appropriateness, that is complicated or poorly understood and needs to be streamlined. We also learned that there was a lot of confusion about the guidelines. And in digging a little deeper, it seemed like part of that was because it's very text heavy, not a lot of graphics, and the text is very long and dense to read. It's not that the information is necessarily inaccurate, it's just the method of presentation, and there are some clear gaps where times have changed or there are new issues to be addressed that aren't addressed. And then this idea that we want these guidelines to be easy to use, so we don't feel like we have to set aside a weekend to read them to be able to begin planning our project. I want to be able to dive in, get the information we need for our project, and then move on. That's true. We heard that from both the property owners, the town staff. We heard that from the board also, who's trying to use this document to guide their decision making. So that was the feedback we heard that was pretty common. We also, to get a broader understanding, and particularly knowing that there are a lot of property owners who aren't in Cape Charles and it's not convenient to sit down and talk with us in person, not to mention COVID, we did a public opinion survey that we put up online. And we did a flyer in each utility bill to let people know about that survey. We also provided a link on the town website. We included information at our first public meeting about it. The idea was to gain some understanding of the public's perception of the historic district, how it's valued, how it feels to live or work here, how it feels to try and undertake a renovation here. And then also to get feedback specifically from anyone who's used the guidelines that exist now. What is their perspective? Do they have recommendations? Are there things that are working well? So those were the types of questions we asked. There was some skepticism in the first public meeting about whether anyone would participate. We were really pleased that we had 105 respondents. That to us felt like a fairly successful public opinion survey in the context of COVID and with a lot of distant property owners. This is the breakdown of who those 105 were. 64%, almost 2/3, own a historic property, so that really helps us know that we got to the right audience. We also have a group of folks who are interested in history and preservation, and then we have some relatively small numbers of people who either enjoy historic properties or affiliated with an organization. But the vast majority of our responses came from the folks who are affected by these guidelines, and that's exactly what we want to see. So we put this is called a word cloud, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen it before. The smaller words represent the magnitude or number of respondents who use that phrase. The larger the word, the more people use the phrase. So it's designed to help put in perspective the different views. By far, charming, quaint, and unique were the top three. There was a lot of commonality among the respondents that they would describe Cape Charles as charming, quaint, and unique. Historic was a big one. Walkable. Some of the smaller ones tended to be more negative. Restrictive, haphazard, compromised, confused. But I wanted to put this up here because I wanted to make 2 points. One is that there's a very positive feeling about the charming, quaint character that connects directly to the fact that people value the aesthetics. But we also have a broad range of folks that we're trying to work with who all have legitimate opinions. And some of those folks don't agree with the majority of the group. And we have to take that into account. We also asked, can you name any other community with a historic district that Cape Charles should look to as an example? And what we were trying to look for there is, an aspirational exercise, what do you want Cape Charles to look like 10 years from now? Because the design guidelines that we write will set in motion what the community looks like 10 years from now. And if we don't get it right, and if the board doesn't follow the guidelines, 10 years from now, we're not going to be able to undo the damage. We're not going to be able to turn the tide easily. So we have to get it right in this moment so that we build the right future. And again, we have a variety of views. Seaside, Florida is one of the less selected examples or less noted communities, but it's on that list. Seaside, Florida is a largely modern community. So that tells you that there are folks who are looking for that type of aesthetic in this community who are stakeholders. The vast majority of folks said Cape May, New Jersey. And I have to tell you, if you guys saw how restrictive the design guidelines are in Cape May, New Jersey, you wouldn't believe it. They regulate font style for signs in their business district. So seeing Cape May, New Jersey on there is a real challenge for us because we're hearing from the community that they value the aesthetics. They like Cape May, New Jersey, but they don't want the regulation. So
Sounds like Cape Charles.
I point that out so you can really understand the challenge that you put before us and the challenge that we've tried to take on. And-
Equal value to Colonial Williamsburg and not Williamsburg.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We want Colonial Williamsburg. We don't want to be Williamsburg. That's really challenging to deal with, right?
We're not even at period.
But I will also say you're not alone. We're having the same conversations right now with a couple of other communities with the same drivers. And I have to tell you, this is an important exercise for us to do in every community, but we can nearly predict what the outcome is going to be every time, right? So based on this, and based on the scope of work, and based on what we promised John Hosey and the town that we would do, we're going to try to take a middle-of-the-road approach. And that middle-of-the-road approach is very strategic. You guys want to protect your historic resources. Those are of value. So we are going to be more restrictive on the treatment of those historic buildings, and we're going to let go of a lot on the modern elements. Okay? We're going to try and improve and streamline the process. We're going to try and address the key takeaways that we have from the public opinion surveys. Those being the community values we discussed, the goals that we heard from you, and the fact that you all have had a rapid amount of change in a very short time. That means turnover in property owners, staff, people who are from out of town who bought for a particular reason but didn't really realize the regulations that went behind that. And then also just the composition of the community, from being a relatively, slow, quiet town to this tourist draw in the summer that really changes the dynamics a little bit and also the points of strain on the community. How can we address all of these key takeaways in a set of guidelines while making it Colonial Williamsburg but not Colonial Williamsburg? So, using all of that input, we've come up with a series of priorities and goals. Okay? We want to respond to the stakeholder input. We believe very strongly that a local historic district needs to reflect the philosophy of its community. Many residents in the community do not work in preservation daily, so they may not understand why some of these regulations exist, and that means that we need to study them and make sure that they're important, and then also educate as to why. We want to respond to the guiding philosophy that we were given at the beginning of the project. We want to retain the historic district's character. That's a priority. We've heard it from everyone. Everyone can agree on that. We want to educate everyone who's going to use these guidelines so that the processes make more sense, it's easier to follow, people understand why they're being asked to do certain things. And then we have to make sure that it meets the standards for rehabilitation, the most lenient of the Park Service standards that represent professional best practices. So these are our priorities and goals that were basically written by this community. Okay? I went one slide too far, I'm sorry.
All good.
So Katie is the person who's the project manager. She has really been responsible for content development, and so I'm going to let her walk you through how we're going to achieve those goals.
Can everybody hear me okay? I tend to talk quietly, so just tell me to speak up. So from those priorities and goals, we built out this framework, which is what we use to sort of develop our content in a way that sort of responds to all of the feedback we heard. So when we write a section or we develop the table of contents, we have this in mind. So one of the main things that I know Paige has already touched on was defensible decision making. So that's very important in a district that's regulated where you have neighbors applying for similar things. I want new windows. My neighbor got new windows of this type 5 years ago. Why can't I have those? So just sort of starting out with a set of guidelines, starting with a clean slate with this new set of guidelines saying, this is what we're going to use moving forward, and really kind of fleshing those out so that the board has the tools necessary to make those decisions consistently over time. And not just the board now, but the board 10 years from now when it's, 5 different people than it is right now. So the main thing there is to provide a consistent set of guidelines for existing and future stakeholders to follow. And another thing Paige touched on, all of these we've heard already, managing change. So those Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, those were written to manage change. So we don't want to stop change. We know change is going to happen. And to make a historic district viable for years to come, you want it to be used. So if you can't change what you have, it's not going to be used, and then it will deteriorate and we don't have it anymore. So the goal here is to preserve the historic district while also welcoming community development. Another main thing is to support all user groups. So we have many people in town who use these, property owners who are making changes, review board members who are using these to review applications, town council members when they do see appeals, hopefully on the rare occasion moving forward, and then staff who is processing applications. So we want to make sure the guidelines are universally accessible to all of those user groups because they obviously come from many different backgrounds, and many different people, don't have in-depth knowledge of preservation. So it's good to make them, simple and easy to understand and follow. And then the last one is clarity and education. So this, I'll get into the table of contents after this, and you'll kind of see how this works out, but just sort of providing background knowledge. So all of the overview that Paige has provided tonight will be included in the guidelines, information on the CLG designation, enabling authority at the state level. All of that's in the guidelines, so you really have one place you can go to where you can really get a good understanding of what is this historic district, why does it exist, and what does it mean to me as a property owner. So I'm going to give you just a brief content preview, and obviously at the end, if you have any specific questions, we'll answer those. As John mentioned, we have delivered our first draft, which is a pretty text-heavy draft. We want to get the content kind of sorted out before we work on graphics, but we have included some graphics in this just so you can kind of get a feel for what it's going to look like, and hopefully feel good about how it's organized and feel that it's going to be clear and easy to use. So here on the left, that's the cover of the new guidelines. And Jess, I wish she was here to talk about it because she did such a good job on these, but the little, like, I don't know, peak, yeah. She took that when we first started this project, and we've done work in Cape Charles before, but she was really struck by all of the front gable roofs when you drive into town, especially down Randolph Avenue, that sort of visual where you see these peaks down the road. So she really wanted to honor that in the guidelines, and so that's a motif you've seen throughout the presentation tonight and that you'll see throughout the guidelines. So she was really kind of intentional about her choices and wanting those to reflect the community. So that's just sort of, I think, a neat thing to add. And the colors, I believe she took from the city, or the town seal, which represent, you know, sand, sun, water, sky. So if you look on the right, this is an old version of the table of contents, but you kind of see how it's laid out. So the first two chapters in light yellow are sort of the intro chapters that kind of explains the purpose of having a local district, the background information on certified local government, things like that. And then the second chapter is the application and review process. So then as you move through, you can kind of see how things are grouped. The second two are information about the historic district itself and the historic resources. And then the next four chapters are the guidelines in light blue. And then the last two chapters are in dark blue, and those are sort of extra materials. And we've actually added another chapter onto that as well. So this is, these are the main chapters, so you can actually read them, because I know you couldn't see them on the table of contents slide. But we wanted to put these up here just so you can kind of get an overview of how it's going to be laid out. The chapter we added was flood mitigation. That's something we just have seen come up more and more in communities we work with, and knowing that this is a coastal community, we wanted to at least put some information in there that you can use, you know, as the town goes along and as flood concerns maybe continue to rise. So I'm going to talk about these in each chunk. We'll have the framework pie chart on all the next slides, and I'll kind of talk about how each section of the guidelines addresses kind of those parts of the framework. So the first four chapters, as I mentioned, really kind of get at this clarity and education of why we have a historic district overlay, what that means, who regulates it, what you have to do. So a lot of really kind of informational information in these sections. So this is a preview of chapter 4. So this is, and I believe this exists in the current guidelines, but we are kind of reworking it a little bit. But essentially, we'll have sort of a simplified graphic of an architectural style, and then you can see on the side where we have terms highlighted. All highlighted terms you see here will end up in a glossary at the end of the guidelines. They won't be highlighted like this in the actual guidelines. We just kind of did this for review purposes, so that could be conveyed. But we'll have a page for each style, examples from within the district, which you see here, and then a very kind of graphic representation of a simplified version of that style with the character defining features of that style called out in text. So it's sort of like a combination of a list where you can read about these things, but then also be able to see what we mean when we're talking about them. And this becomes important later. We talk within the guidelines themselves about character-defining features and being able to identify the style of building you have and the important features to retain will kind of help you know when you're making modifications how to plan your project to retain those features and where you might be able to have more flexibility if you're working on features that aren't character defining for your style. So chapter 5 is the historic building treatment chapter. So these are the resources that are contributing to the district. And this is really where we get into the defensible decision making. So we have a section on interpreting the guidelines where we kind of explain how the chapter's set up. And then we talk about the framework and that being sort of the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And we always include sort of a simplified version of that. So it's essentially a list of 10 sentences that describe how you should treat historic buildings. And when you distill that, you can really get it down to a single word. And I'm sorry we didn't include it here because I do think it's very useful, but it will definitely be in the guidelines and we'll be sure to include it in our next presentation. I actually think we included it in our first presentation, which is probably why we didn't do it in this one. But it really helps you kind of understand what these somewhat esoteric standards mean. So we always think that's important to include in a document that's being used by a wide variety of people. We also tend to include a section on routine maintenance and in-kind repairs. That's important for a lot of reasons, but essentially that kind of work doesn't need a COA in most communities. So we like to call out kind of what that entails. So maybe if you're starting a project and you don't know and you read that and you're like, well, I don't even have to go to the HDRB. It is usually good to check with staff to make sure, the extent of your work doesn't go beyond what is considered just maintenance and repair, but that's all covered in that section. And then we get into kind of the bulk of the guidelines. So this is really the hefty chapter where we're dealing specifically with the historic resources. And as Paige mentioned, this is really where the restrictions are. So we've tried to build these out to cover things that aren't necessarily either not covered or not clear in the current guidelines. So then the next two chapters are the guidelines for non-historic building treatment and then new construction and infill guidance. So these are much lighter chapters. Obviously, if you have a modern resource, we're less concerned with you retaining the materials on it because they're not historic. So we purposefully make these more lenient because it's less of a concern what happens to these resources. The main concern is that changes to these resources don't detract from adjacent historic resources or the overall historic district. And then new construction and infill guidance, that's primarily related to building placement, orientation, massing scale, form, and that, again, is just to ensure that the character of new construction doesn't overpower, the historic resources within the district. And then at the end, we sort of have a site and setting section with signage and public art included. Public art has come up a lot. We didn't hear a lot about that in our stakeholder interview, so if anybody has strong feelings about that, let us know. We were sort of having trouble with that section, just not having heard a lot about that in our interviews and feedback. And then we have a whole chapter dedicated to alternative materials. And then I have a couple of slides after this on that chapter because I know it's a hot topic. It's a hot topic everywhere. So we like to include some educational information related to alternative materials. We talk about how to evaluate alternative materials. We actually always develop a flow chart for how to consider alternative materials and when they're appropriate to use on a historic building and when they're not, as well as documentation requirements. We include that because oftentimes we hear from communities that, I wanted to replace my windows and I took a picture and it wasn't enough for the board, so I had to come back. So we kind of develop just sort of, a list of requirements so it's very clear what people need to bring to the board to sort of justify their case for wanting to remove a historic material or use a replacement material. And then there are separate considerations for historic buildings and non-historic buildings. And those are all outlined in this chapter. Relocation and demolition, that shows up in every guidelines document, nothing new there. And then the flood mitigation chapter, which I mentioned earlier. So these are all related to managing change. And these are a few just snapshots from, these are actually from another project we did. We're still developing the graphics, so we just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what kind of educational materials there will be in this section. So we always include some facts about window replacements, you know, and energy efficiency, because a lot of people replace their windows to make their house more energy efficient when really 31% of energy loss is through the roof, walls and ceilings, and not the windows. But anyways, just that's sort of the idea. So just to give you some, you know, context and just some information. And then this is our flow chart, and the top part's cut off, but I think it's just the title. So, but the way this works is you kind of work through, it's a set of questions, and homeowners and the review board will both use this equally, but it's just sort of a way where you can organize your thoughts around, you know, when you're working through whether you need to replace an element of your building, you know, can it be repaired? If it can't be repaired, what happens next? So it just sort of helps you walk through the thought process in a way that's organized so everybody's walking through the process in the same manner.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Where, that was one of the things I had noted. Where would that fall in the process? Like where, if I were going to look for that, if this, then this, where would you guys expect that to fall in the?
In the review process?
No,
In the design guides.
The written material.
So that's in the alternative material chapter.
Okay.
So in the design guidelines, we walk through a lot of scenarios in each section, and if this isn't available and this isn't available, then an
Yeah.
alternative material may be appropriate.
Right.
Refer to chapter 9.
Right.
So we always point to that chapter when alternative materials come up, either in the contributing or non-contributing chapters, just because otherwise we're putting it in there twice. And we're open to suggestions on how to handle that.
Right.
We've done it a few different ways, but this always seems to feel most
Right.
natural to us, but it's draft 1, so if you want to see it in two
No,
places
sure,
or
I just-
whatever.
It's hard to read that to know
Yeah.
what that said, so I wasn't.
So
I hadn't
essentially
seen
you
that.
start by saying, can the existing feature be repaired?
Right,
Because if it can be repaired, then you don't even go down,
right.
you don't need to replace it, you can fix
Yeah.
it. So that's kind of the thing, and I think that just taking a minute to kind of pause and really
Yes.
evaluate the issue,
Mhm.
you know, may solve,
It
you know,
does. I agree. And
some of the
I
problems
think the
on that one.
visual of that is a good friendly format. I
yeah,
just couldn't get a feel for where it, you know, it is so much information.
right,
Like
mm-hmm,
when somebody would get to that,
right,
to use that tool.
mm-hmm, yeah, I understand that.
And we also anticipate, and we put a lot of time in the table of contents because we don't expect someone to sit down and
Right.
on guidelines from
Yeah.
cover to cover.
Yes.
We want them to go to the table of contents, find what they need, and be able to get to that. If you want to read it cover to cover,
Go for it.
it's well written.
Yeah.
Katie does a great
beautifully
job,
done.
but it's just a lot.
Yes, it is. Okay. Thank you.
And that is, you know, obviously if you have a non-contributing resource, you don't need to read chapter 5, which is the longest in the book about,
Right.
you know, historic buildings. So, and I think another important thing to add, just in terms of ease of use, is this will be available online, and all of the table of contents will be linked, and then we'll also have links within when we refer to other sections. So that'll make it very you know, not everybody's gonna have a 100-page
Right.
binder with paper. You know, you'll be able to kind of click through a little bit more
Yeah.
easily than maybe you do currently. So,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. And then we just kind of wanted it, that was sort of it for examples, but we wanted to end with sort of an overall view of our schedule. Our boxes got a little wonky in the conversion, but so we've highlighted all of the public input opportunities that there have been so far and that will come in the future. So we're on public meeting number 2, which is highlighted in orange. We had an online public meeting in November. Time is flying by. And then, as John mentioned earlier, once we develop draft 2, that will be available online for public comment before we make any revisions towards the final. And then there will be a 3rd public meeting and town council adoption sort of at the end of the process. So, and we have a handout that has the schedule on it if anybody wants to take that with them as a reference. And now we'll open it up to questions and discussion.
And I think just to kind of set the stage, we really want to hear questions. We understand you haven't looked at a draft of the guidelines, but we'd like to start with how you feel about the framework, how you feel about the approach we're taking to make sure that, as we develop the content, we're on the right track. We have just put the guidelines for citizen participation that the town uses so that, we're reflecting what you guys have agreed to as a community. And we've got some charts, so any questions that are recorded, so we can take them back and make sure that we incorporate them into our thinking. So with that, yes.
Has any consideration been given as to how we're gonna disseminate this information to the community?
That is a question for Mr. Booth.
I'm sorry,
How are we gonna get this information out to the community before they buy or before they do work? Is there gonna be some sort of a information campaign when the guidelines are out? Because it's great to have this, and we have had guidelines, but very few of the people have ever read them or even know they exist.
Kathy, we talked about that at our joint planning historic town council meeting last year. I don't remember when that was, as a real problem area. So that we realtors have them and we do a campaign for them to make sure they're sharing them. But also that we're communicating to our residents, this is how you can access it online. So I do think that needs to happen. We have talked about that in several, it might have been through strategic planning or somewhere that.
right, and one of the ideas that have come up, and we haven't landed on this specifically, but I like the concept. We've done it in other areas, is to come up with a very simple one-page piece of paper that's a trifold. That has very, here's your step-by-step. So if you want to open a business in Cape Charles, Main Street did a great job of putting together a simple trifold. Here's the steps you use. I can see something like that, tools like that we can hand out to realtors or have at town hall, put online for people to walk through that will take them, tell them what the requirements are and where the information is.
Another question. You talked about simplifying the application process. How's that gonna happen? Is that something you will help us with? Or is that something that we have to figure out?
Well, we have in the guidelines themselves, our first draft has incorporated a bunch of recommendations that we even made
like a slightly longer application that kind of walks everybody through step by step, each wall, within the wall, the doors, the windows, so that they know they're checking yes or no, I am doing this. If I am, this is the information I need to provide. Because that's a lot of what staff is struggling with, and I think the board struggles with, is to easily locate that information, see it, the materials, layout, numbers, and if that meets our standards or guidelines in this case. So we are working to revise the application to tailor to how the guidelines are coming to us at this point, so that people can say, no, I'm not doing this work. Because that's one of the challenges here is we're having many modifications come forward because they didn't tell us everything they wanted to do in round one. And so we want to make sure they're identifying all the elements that would happen, and really only have them come to the board hopefully just once and be complete. So we understand, we've been working in tandem as I'm getting product from Commonwealth Preservation Group. We are working in tandem to start making our tweaks to the application draft to hopefully get it finalized in tandem with this coming up.
Got lots of sheets to write.
I have to ask my question, since you gave us the great graphic of all the communities identified that people compare us to or think about or similar to. So when you're doing this in other communities, does anybody ever put Cape Charles on their list?
Yes.
I don't know if they
That's
know.
Project did. Virginia Beach was a very different project because they have 16 overlay districts, and all but 2 of them are single buildings. It was a very different project. Really stretched us, but I think it turned out well. But stuff is definitely pointed to Cape Charles, and is London? No, we have London. I think so.
That's probably because they were home there. Out of all those, the 2/3 that basically are the historic home ownership, did you guys put any length of time they've been here, or?
We did ask a question about, we had chunks of time, I want to say like 0 to 5 years, 6 to 10.
All right.
And we've got all of that data, we already gave you a lot tonight, and we had to kind of distill it down a little bit, but we can give you all that information.
Right, and then the other question I have, my business is making signs. Where did you guys come up with the list of materials? Just curious. MDF I would never use because it doesn't work with water.
Yeah, and
That's why I was wondering where this list came from.
we've developed that list over various design guideline projects, collecting different materials that communities do or do not use. And that's a good point, given where we are, that's probably
Yeah, even
not a good choice.
architectural foam is a disaster. The wind here is just incredible.
Yeah.
I use PVC, believe it or not, and I paint it, and you can't tell it's PVC.
So that's the kind of feedback that we need to
Yeah.
make sure these guidelines are right for Cape Charles.
It's just one of the things, it's just the wind is incredibly terrible. Woods, for modern day signs, trying to make a wood sign, they last 3 to 5 years before they rot. You can paint them all you want, they're so porous, they just rot.
And
Because the wood is terrible.
really- That we need that in
Yeah.
our draft one comments, because that's the kind of stuff we're looking for, so we make sure that we get it right.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, I was looking at the specifics and materials, it's like, this is a pretty odd list.
And you realize your comments are due to me by tomorrow, right?
Oh, yeah.
I have one basic comment that's really important, page numbers.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Because in giving my comments, I can't reference the page
Right.
number, so I'm having to
Yeah.
go chapter 2, 4th paragraph down. So
Yeah,
if we
yeah,
can put those
when
in draft 2, that would be great.
Well, draft 2 will be in layout.
Okay.
Um,
It's just hard to give
Prohibited by
comment on this amount without having a page.
if you
Numbers.
just,
That's okay.
chapter.
I am, but it's still then you have to go through
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that
second
was
page of
back.
chapter 2, 4th thing.
Yeah.
It's a lot of words.
Yeah, it is a lot.
Text patio.
And my brain is been lost about what I was talking about then,
I
so
just saw it.
it's more user error.
Temperatures, landscaping, signage. I saw it, it was just,
something in the,
they do have porches in here.
and I know this is not a finished document, but you talk about if something can't be repaired, that you would like to have a letter or documentation from an architect that is experienced in historic buildings. That's an expense and a hard thing to find over here.
Well, I think, what we're trying, we worked in a lot of communities, where we've gotten feedback that, people come in and they want to replace materials, and either no one with experience with this, or
That's 5-3. Yeah. 5-4-3.
we are constantly trying to look for language that will, again,
I knew I
remember,
saw it.
protect
Was that
the
just-
historic materials, that's the goal, that's the purpose of the district. And if you go into the extent of replacing that historic material, that's a decision that you can only make once and you can never undo. So there's typically kind of a higher level of documentation required for removal and wholesale replacement, because it can never be undone.
Do you think if because you talk about the better application, if we had better pictures and better descriptions and those sort of things, that it would make it,
Yeah, and, maybe we tweak the language to say at the discretion of the staff, the board can request, documentation from an person experienced in historic properties or something like that. That's the kind of feedback we want, because every community has kind of different, level of expectations. From our perspective as professionals, we think there should be some thought and analysis before character defining versus how we get to that, we're putting out an idea, and if that idea doesn't work well in this community, then we need to revise that idea based on feedback.
because one of the big concerns that I heard from the community is that a lot of the restrictions we put cost more money. Increases the cost of the renovation to where they maybe can't do it or won't do it because they can't afford the additional cost. So I don't think we need to burden them with additional costs on top of it.
So again, I think there are other ways to kind of have that, checkpoint. We want to remove a character-defining feature on a historic building, which we've all agreed as a community that historic buildings are what we're trying to protect. What does that check mark look like? How do we ensure that it's necessary and that a contractor isn't just trying to make a few extra bucks? Or, there are a lot of things that can happen, where a property owner thinks they're doing the right thing and maybe doesn't have all the information. So we're trying to make sure that if we're making that big decision to remove an historic character defining feature and replace it with something new, that there's a pause and consideration at that point. So again, if there's another way to approach that, we welcome feedback.
Well, does the board have any professionals that advise?
Well, if you want
Sure, I'll weigh in, and I know Mr. Hosey can weigh in, is, the composition of the board itself is required to have certain, professional experience or standards within that makeup. And I didn't bring it with me off the top of my head, so I'm gonna wing it. Never a good thing, but, so that we have, people who have trades in building experience are members of our historic district review board. I think we would like to have some sort of historic architect of some feature. We don't currently have anyone with that caliber, sitting on our board. So there are, within the ordinance itself, it states that we have to have, certain membership representation, for the trades and like.
We don't have anyone.
Yeah, ordinance committee, her, thank you.
Right. That's a requirement, but we don't always have the applicants that fill it. So we get as close as we can to it, but we can't always get to the letter of the law.
That's where I think if you had an advisor to the board, like most,
And that is written in there, that you can seek outside
Yes.
advice.
Yes, and so far, my tenure, and again, I've only been with the town 11 months. We just have
Yeah.
We've had to get structural engineering reports, and they've been willing to obtain those and provide that information to the board to help them make their decisions as to how to handle that request coming forward. But our composition of the board, we're trying to seek people with experience, historical and architectural development of the town, with a potentially licensed architect or engineer. We have a member of the planning commission who brings that whole planning perspective to the table and where the town is in its planning development, as well as a licensed building contractor. So we've been very fortunate. Our board has had some of that experience come to the table. I think up until 2 years ago, you actually had somebody who was a historic contractor, some magnitude architect. And that really helped.
But I think also,
You did.
you sort of referenced it. In my experience, typically when something's damaged beyond repair, as long as the documentation, the photographic documentation is clear, the board can usually make a decision. Where it becomes questionable is the photographic documentation, it doesn't look like it's beyond repair, and someone's just trying to replace something because it's too fast and easy, or for some other reason. Maybe they were told it was beyond repair and it's not really. And at that point, it's you know, we have to make a decision. How do you want to get that assurance that it truly requires replacement? Going back again to the idea that the purpose is to protect the historic fabric in the district that everyone can agree that a lot of people are doing. So certainly, you know, in review of the document, please put forward any suggestions you have. That's why we can do these drafts in an iterative way. So we can make this kind of change.
Okay. If there's,
Julie, we have anybody, any questions being asked?
Yeah, I just have a comment. It's not a question. It's a comment, and it might sound like I'm splitting hairs, but it has to do with semantics. And I think this nice one back here kind of exemplified it when she made, and I don't know the whole sentence, but she was talking about standards versus guidelines. These are called guidelines, and I think we're new to town, and we went before the historic board, had very good experience, but we were confused when a document is called guidelines. It leads me to believe that it's just a guide. They're not required, because then they would be a standard. And it's maybe we're just because we're not used to the documents in town. Maybe we're just not reading it properly. But I think that if it's confusing to us, it'll be confusing to other people. What constitutes a standard and what constitutes a guideline? And how are they different, or are they different?
I'll answer that from the sort of perspective of someone who works in a lot of communities, and then I'm sure the town staff will kind of correct me and give the nuances for Paige. In my experience, a standard is a codified, clear directive that you must follow. Historic buildings are anything but clear. They are not, you know, every building is a little bit different.
Yeah.
The factors, the decision-making, the
shall be used in the guidelines, or is it should?
Right now it should in most of the applications.
Or-
We typically reserve shall for things that are by zoning. Like, for example, a fence height maximum is a zoning
Okay.
decision. And then there's the overlay, and those are, we change between should and shall based on the community's direction.
Got it.
That's part,
Okay, sorry.
yeah, no, I'm saying that's part of what we're trying to do with this update is to try and pull some of those shalls and shoulds apart. So anything that's a standard, as you say it, that's going to fall more to the zoning administrator to make the call because that's a standard. Anything where you may have to apply independent judgment, then it would go to the board. But I agree with Paige that while not strictly the letter of the law, if they're not going to be consistently used, why have them? You know, so you do have, so there is a fine line there. You want to try to apply it consistently, and we want to have something that people can understand and know what to expect from, but at the same time, allow for that judgment call when needed.
And it also allows property owners to, if they can build an adequate pace, as to why their needs can't be met in the guidelines, or why, that situation that they're applying a review of can't be met in the guidelines. So,
I'd just like to add, too, that there is often confusion when we talk about the district. The historic district overlay is the name of the zoning ordinance. It's the historic district overlay zone. It is a zoning regulation in and of itself. The word overlay, as Paige mentioned, or John mentioned in his opening comments, is the fact that you have an underlying zoning district that's regulating what uses can happen in that district. Is it a residential district? Is it a commercial district? Is it a mixed-use district? That's regulating your uses. An overlay district is another zoning district that sits on top of that, that is addressing something specific. In this case, it's addressing historic preservation within that underlying area. So as a zoning district in and of itself, it's a regulation. The tools that implement that district are written in that ordinance, the overlay district ordinance. So look to the zoning ordinance first. And Katie, as the zoning administrator, is administering that. In that ordinance, it establishes the district as its overlay zone. It establishes the review board as the group that's been empowered by town council, given council's authority to review applications and make decisions. In some cases, they can be administratively reviewed. And the ordinance specifically says, to do all of this, there's a set of guidelines that are going to guide how these decisions get made. So I think that's where it gets a little confusing because it's starting with the regulation, but one of the tools to implement that regulation is a set of guidelines that are guiding. And people are like, well, are they guidelines or are they standards? So they are guidelines, as Paige indicated and John, that they're there to be used through the process and to be applied consistently with independent judgment. And if a decision is made that there's an appeals process to then take it to council. So there's no shalls in the guidelines because they are guidelines. But the guidelines must be used. See that difference? Because the ordinance is saying, this is the tool that we use in this district.
I understand.
Well, I like to say,
It's been a problem of interpretation.
I'm not saying that it is,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it is, it's just,
Human nature.
Yeah.
I can see where it could be.
I-
We are on this street.
so a lot of the reason why we're here right now is to clear up some of that, because it's over the past, there has been interpretation and opinions and stuff, and so we're trying to narrow that down right now, so to take some of that out of the equation. So that's part of the purpose of the update.
Well, and that's, at the beginning of, the presentation, I said, you guys are, when we get to that point where the new guidelines are adopted, we're all just gonna have to agree that we're gonna let them work for a period, right? Before we start saying, well, my neighbor got this approved 2 years ago, well, that was under a different set of guidelines. And we have a new set of guidelines, with new expectations, and we all have to commit to those, and we have to put them to use, get in our roles, get comfortable with using them and interpreting them. And that's gonna be a transition, that's natural, this is a big change. And as a community, I think the implementation of guidelines will be much more successful if we kind of go into that, understanding it's a big change and we all have to kind of commit to it.
I got a question. Are you gonna address violations in the new set of guidelines and penalties, and how that be carried out?
That is more process. I mean, we certainly have background in helping communities go through that, but that's typically, penalties are typically in the ordinance. And the process of enforcement is typically a process document. The guidelines typically are all about treatment of buildings. Now, we certainly can incorporate the process that exists as an informational component of the guidelines in kind of that first set of chapters that tells you all about the district. If there are changes, which, we're working in tandem on all of this, we've got the current information in the guidelines draft. But if there are changes coming, we'll need to update that.
I just think as an information thing, it should be in the guidelines. If you don't do what you're asked of from the board, that there should be some kind of violation and penalty.
So there is, the current, the status quo, the current process and the current penalties are in draft one, as is the appeal process. I mean, we put it all in there because we feel like this is a resource guide for property owners and we need to be able to see it all. But there's this kind of evolution of how the town staff wants to, and the board want to handle the process of it. And so you may see that change as we move forward, as a result of changes there. We're not driving the decision making on what those penalties are, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but we are incorporating the information.
Will there be some kind of wording in there to say?
Yes, the
Yeah.
information will be there, but we're not making recommendations about what the penalties are. But whatever they are, we put them in the guidelines. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just hope someone follows through on that, because we had a couple of dozen violations hanging right now, and they just keep dragging on and keep dragging on, and nothing's been done about it. And I hope new guidelines will clear some of that up.
Yeah, absolutely. We think enforcement is critical because why comply if you don't
Exactly.
in enforcement? And then it becomes, well, I would comply, but my neighbor isn't, and then, the whole thing falls apart. But we have to find a sustainable way for enforcement to happen. And that's a conversation we had early on to put them on.
I don't want anybody to walk away and think that the guidelines will magically fix our enforcement
Yeah.
component of the town's obligation. That's a staffing issue and challenge that the town needs to devote resources. We are recently working in that direction to devote staff just for that purpose. So that falls in a whole different policy component of government, that's all. I don't want anybody to think the adoption of guidelines magically solves, telling you enforce violations. It doesn't.
But the rules in order of how that happens and the penalties, those will be in the guidelines, so it's clear what they are. But then the town's got it, and we, at the first time we met, we said, you've got to have enforcement or else these guidelines are not going to be worth what they're written on. So I know that's something the town has got to work through.
I think if we can make it clear, make the
I have a comment if I can. And thanks for this information tonight. It's been, I think, well done, well presented. I'm happy with the direction this is headed. I'll do a more thorough review on draft 2 when the graphics are in and it's more in a complete form. I would ask that, and I don't know whether, it's probably you guys to set it up, but I don't like paper, so I want a searchable PDF that's bookmarked for the next draft, if that's doable. And it's interesting as you glance through this, and I'd like someone to comment on it, but we have a lot of discussion, particularly in appeals with regard to alternative materials. And your Chapter 9, as I've glanced at it, seems to be, I mean, you said you wanted to use the rehabilitation standards, which is the least stringent, but as I look at the Chapter 9, it seems to be leaning more towards not doing, not using alternative materials, particularly with regard to windows and siding, saying that, you're not going to save energy, it's not going to pay back, you should use the old windows need to be rehabbed unless they are physically impossible to do that. So in general, for me, Chapter 9 is leaning away from the rehabilitation more towards restoration. So am I reading that wrong, or is it just windows and siding that pop out?
I thought the same thing with porches.
So a couple of things. I think one thing we failed to talk about is the drafts. And I think, I don't want to lose that. So let me answer that first. Through experience, what we have learned is that the best way to approach a new design guidelines project is to give the written content first. When we provide to a client the first draft that has all the graphics, people start focusing on the graphics, and the comments on the written part are not as robust as we need them to be. And at that point, we're way down the line in terms of hours invested in graphics, and then we start to get comments about the content, and then we get into a real mess with our scope and project design. So the first draft is very boring looking. It is black and white, very few graphics. That is because we want you to focus on the words and give us critical feedback on the words. The second version will then have the graphics laid in so you can begin to see how we're illustrating all of those words. But we want to be able to efficiently manipulate the word portion of the document and then overlay the graphics in. So that's just a bit of an explanation about our methodology, which may help. In terms of the section on alternative materials, the Secretary of the Interior standards all contemplate preservation of the historic buildings. So their underlying goal, whether the most restrictive restoration standard or the rehabilitation standard, is if you have historic material that can be maintained and repaired, it should be. And that historic material should only be replaced when replacement is necessary, when it's beyond repair. When, it's the sash breaks in half and, when it's beyond repair, that's when you begin replacing historic material. Because if you enter a cycle of replacement of materials before they need it, you're undermining the integrity of your historic district. So, the rehabilitation standards would say, the first question to ask when someone wants to use an alternative material is it necessary to lose historic fabric? Do we need to replace it? If the answer is yes, it's beyond repair, and that is a judgment call based on the guidelines, not standards, made by the board with education. If it's beyond repair, then these are the ways that you should consider alternative materials. And that flow chart really frames the thinking for when you're looking at an alternative material and trying to decide, is this appropriate for our district?
But I think the challenge that we have, I think consistently with that, and you can add to this, is that it's not necessarily, I'm going to use a porch as an example. We live in a coastal community, wood, this close to the bay, rots quickly. So it's not that it's impossible to replace the wood you're just doing it so frequently and the timing and the effectiveness. So if
Not true.
someone, Ed, I'm speaking, I don't think, we don't need to get into that, it is true. For some people, they want to make the choice to using a composite. I don't see that in here as a option, because clearly I can replace my porch piece by piece every year,
So,
but is that the most efficient thing to do?
okay, so let's break that down a little bit, because this is a good example of how the guidelines might be used, okay? Mr. Grossman comes to the board and says, my porch floor is beyond repair, it's the original porch floor, it's beyond repair, and he provides adequate photo documentation that the board agrees that the porch is beyond repair, the floor. The board has then, in that flow chart, said, yes, we agree it's beyond repair, okay? Then, is an equivalent material available? In my opinion, if I were sitting on that board, I would say an equivalent material is available, because you could, in theory, go get cypress or you could go get mahogany. But there are other questions in that flow chart. Is it reasonable? Is it a character-defining feature? I would argue that it is not a character-defining feature because it's a horizontal surface. It is not highly visible from the street. So that flow chart is designed to frame the conversation so that you can come up with a reasonable solution. Always, though, with the goal of, if the historic material is intact, the purpose of our district is to protect that. When we do design guidelines training, we usually run through a series of mock applications. And I will tell you that different communities, our flow charts vary by community, a little bit here and there, but they have the same kind of theme. And different communities establish different levels of expectations at each decision point in that tree. And part of the reason that we design the flow chart the way we do is that one community might really prioritize preservation of the original material and might have a very high bar for allowing for replacement. But then, in those rare instances where they do, they might be more forgiving of what that material looks like.
Sure.
Another community may say, we're going to be a little bit more lenient on retention of historic material, but we're going to demand that if it's replaced, it will be replaced with a matching material. So different communities have different pressure points on this topic, and that's really a discussion and a decision that needs to be made in the community and then consistently applied.
Right.
The other reason we use a flow chart is because we work in this field every day, and every day there's a new product. And we want the board to be in a position that if someone shows up with a brand new product, and they've never heard of it, they can walk themselves through the flow chart and make a decision without having to tell that applicant, we don't know anything about this material and we need to defer you for a month.
Right. Yeah, flow charts, we just didn't, we don't have that
Yeah.
visual, so
Yeah.
I couldn't put that into
Yeah.
what's written
Yeah,
here.
absolutely.
So,
But the flow chart
totally get it.
is really fundamentally
Yes,
the driver of chapter 9.
yeah.
And I just also want to add, this is draft one, okay? They're doing what we asked them to do, and they're providing their best recommendations. It's just draft one. That's why you were given a copy and asked to provide input, okay? The project committee is meeting next week to take all the input and consolidate it so we can give it to them for draft 2. So the type of input that you're making now is great, but I would also, that plus any other information you have, you can forward that to me in any format you can, even if it's just an email or if it's just a comment. Your deadline was tomorrow, but you can have through the weekend because we're not actually meeting as a project group until Monday. But if you can send me whatever type of impressions you got from just draft one, we'll incorporate that and get it to them, and then we'll continue the conversation.
And I think also if you all see something that you have questions about, that is, when we get the comments, if they are not already in an Excel spreadsheet, we will put them in an Excel spreadsheet. So we are
Right.
thinking and how this gets moved into actual use,
Yeah.
to decide whether we're
I guess going back to my question about the flow chart and the longevity of people, did you take that into consideration, weighting anything, or just based on raw numbers?
I'm
Like,
sorry.
on the flow chart, we had 2/3 of the historic owners. Did you weight any of their longevity of time being in town or any of that kind of information? I'm just curious.
Yeah, honestly, the comments were, so there were very few outliers in the comments.
Okay.
There always are,
Yeah.
but the general consensus was that within a spectrum, everyone had an appreciation for the historic building and wanted better process and wanted to understand things better, wanted more clarity, you know, so there was enough consensus around that it didn't
Okay.
even cross our minds to.
No, I'm just curious because, as you know, it's been going like gangbusters and there's a lot of new people.
Yeah, and honestly, the biggest challenge for us out of that is twofold. For the new people's education and letting them know, in all likelihood, you bought here in part because of the historic character, because you could have gone over to the golf course, if that wasn't important, right?
Yeah, or to the other side.
Or the other side. And then for the folks who've been here a long time, the real challenge that no one can solve, but we can all try and work on, is that whole issue of affordability. And being in a community that you've been in for decades and suddenly, the value has escalated and that changes your property tax rate and all of that. And that's related, certainly. That's a really hard one to address.
Well, yeah, we've addressed that over the years and it's caught up to us.
I'd just like to say, Tammy, my saying not so, not true. A lot of these homes here are well over 100 years that have the original wood siding. Some have the original wood windows, some have the original wood floors. So they do hold up in this environment near the sea if they're properly maintained. I have no problem, we've passed many times putting up composite material on porches, just for the same reason that was brought up. It's not visible from the street, and that was our purview.
I was referencing porches in my I was referencing porches in my comments, not
But you said wood doesn't hold up here.
Well,
when I was talking about porches. That was the
but
context.
I can clarify it too, because having worked in the industry for a number of years, the new modern cypress is terrible. It doesn't hold up at all. We've had to replace multiple porches.
The wood that's here.
Yeah, I get
Yeah,
that. I get that.
Absolutely. I have one of those 115-year-old houses, and I wouldn't replace it with anything other than that. But
You're saying the wood don't hold up.
I'm talking about on the porch, and it is very different how it holds up on the porch because of the moisture from the ground. I mean,
Probably
All right,
maintained,
look, hey, whoa. We're not here to argue, we're not here to bicker, we're here to get stuff done, everybody just stop.
bringing up some facts.
Just stop.
I think that the big change in the flow chart is that we're asking you guys to step back, step in the conversation, and start with whether the material warrants replacement. That often is a question that gets skipped when someone comes in proposing to replace their siding. They don't do the analysis, is that necessary or clean up appropriate? And then the other part of that, which is something the town will have to solve, is how we deal with the property maintenance enforcement. Because those materials that they're maintained, they're not gonna deteriorate and require replacement. So it's that lack of maintenance that in some ways is setting that cycle in motion, and we've gotta solve that. If we're gonna be more lenient on a lot of alternative materials, we have to make sure we're not setting that process in motion with a lack of enforcement. That's a critical piece of this.
Correct.
Anybody have any more questions? Nope. Okay, well, nobody has any more questions. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
so moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Well done, guys.
Thank you very
Yep.
much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.